Real bearded guys ride big horses and chop down trees. City bearded guys brew boutique beer and make lattes and flat whites with pretty pictures in them. I'm into both coffee and beer, but in this video I'm going to take the bearded pilgrimage to a whole new level and design my own instrument dedicated to the beard. This is a first for me. I have never built an instrument myself, so before I set out on my bearded pilgrimage, I'm going to go and have a look at what the developers have done. I'm going to the macro page Designer Extended. When I click on one of the layers inside one of the presets, which are the developers' programs inside of HALion 6, I can now see the macro page in the bottom right-hand corner if I've got that tab selected. We've got the main workspace area there, kind of left of center, and then to the left of that again, we've got the Gui Tree. Now this is kind of like the program tree, except the Gui Tree is dedicated to building the front end or the user interface for our instruments, and that's what we're going to be doing. But first, it's quite nice to be able to see into the minds of the developers, well, kind of. Click on the elements at least and see where they sit inside of the Gui Tree, and also have a look at the properties underneath. Now this is an involved process, but at the same time, it's an easy process. It's about practice, and it's about having fun. And hey, how many people can say, I built my own instrument? That's pretty cool, I think. Well, I like it anyway. Now, first up, I've created a blank program, and I've just gone straight away to my macro page extended designer. In the bottom right-hand corner, we've got the sound editor tab and the macro tab, which will show us our macro page live. It's almost like a live feed of exactly what we're doing. Before you start wondering, I do not have superpowers. I've sped what I'm doing at the moment up because we've covered this in many other videos. At the moment, in the program tree, I've got a program layer with trigger pads and the flex phaser. Below that, I've created my own layer with 2 MIDI LFOs and a synth zone and a program bus. Before we start doing anything, we've got to create a macro page. We can't do that unless we've got the right element or layer selected over in the program tree. So this icon up in the top left-hand corner is grayed out or blacked out, so I can't actually see it. So I need to make sure I've got the right layer selected. When I click on the main program layer, or the beard, which is the layer inside the main program layer, I can now create a macro page. Now the first option will allow me to create a macro page or a user interface for HALion 6. The second option is a template that comes specifically for HALion Sonic. So we need to choose this if we are intending to build instruments for HALion Sonic or HALion Sonic SE. It's got the size automatically locked in. And up in the Gui Tree, you can see the macro page folder and the background, which is also down in the bottom right-hand corner in the live macro feed. The next tab over is the Templates tab. It's got the properties below it, and I'm going to explain this a little bit later on. To the right, we've got the Resources tab or section, and already we've got this background image, so that's a resource. So any resources that we add are going to show up over there. As I scroll through my program tree, you'll see that parameter list changing. So there's a bunch of parameters that are already linked that we can match up very easily with resources. I'm going to start by adding my very own custom designed background picture. I was really surprised at how easy this was to just drag into the Gui Tree. You can also drag and drop it straight into the work area. I sent the correct file size requirements through to the graphic designer, and it's come back and it doesn't look like it fits. If I go over to my Resources tab and click on my background picture, you can see the whole picture, not just the cropped area. I need to get this background picture into a size that's going to work for the HALion Sonic template. Back over in the GUI tab, you'll notice that if I drag the default background picture above mine, it comes to the front. So that's an important point. Whatever's at the top gets seen first. In the Properties section below hand, if I've got my picture selected, I can see the size and the position. You're definitely not going to want every graphic that you bring in to be scalable, but in this case, I do. I can see the size for a macro page in the parameters of the macro page folder, and all I need to do is make sure that my own settings match these. So if I go back to my picture and enter them into the size boxes, then immediately my picture will be scaled, and it should be perfect. There it is. I can get precise control over my size and my positioning by using these boxes down in the Properties section. Let's delete that default background, and you can do that just by selecting it and hitting delete on your computer keypad. You can do that for anything inside of the Gui Tree, and of course there's always undo if you've accidentally deleted something. We're all beginners here, and I'm going to show you one of the coolest things. Down the bottom in the browser section, there's this menu that gives you access to a whole series of different controls or resources that the developers have included as part of this macro page designer. You can also BYO or bring your own, but this makes it super easy for us to get started. I've gone into the knob menu in Anima and I'm just dragging up this white knob anywhere just onto the macro page. As soon as I do that, it appears in the Gui tree, and below in the properties section, I get a list of properties specifically for this one knob. Now, this is where templates come into play. This knob is a template, which is a collection of resources and even commands or controls. If I click on the E button, I can go into the template editor and I can see just what's going on for this one knob, which looks quite innocuous. But watch what happens when I put my mouse over it. If I hover over it, it shows me the value. So there has to be a command up in the templates or in my Gui tree that says, hey, when this happens, do this. The properties section contains a lot of really important information about things like how the actual template itself is going to behave. I can change the font of the text inside of a particular element. I can also change how that element behaves when things like the template as a whole is resized or rescaled. I could say, hey, make sure that this stays to the left or to the right or to the top or to the bottom or even in the center. There's a whole lot of elements that make up this template, but we can define exactly what we want people to see when they click on this template out in the main GUI window. Now I can use the position parameters to move the knob around on the macro page, or I could change the size. But if I change the size, I can also set scalable rules, once again, that says it must behave in a particular manner. Down the bottom, we can assign a parameter in the value. We can name it. So at the moment, I'm naming it. And as soon as I do, you can see that the name's appeared out in the main macro page. And we can change the unit. Here's a good example of a template. As I hover my mouse now, the label is changing to the unit, so the template's telling it to behave in that manner. As always, the program tree is involved in everything, and when I change my focus in the program tree, the parameter list changes. Now I've got a list of parameters that are mapped specifically for the synth zone. If I go to my first oscillator folder, I can pick up on the mix parameter and drop it straight on to that knob. Now I can control the level of my first oscillator, but the flex phrase is on, so I'm focusing on that. I'm going to the sound tab and I'm just turning it off, and then go straight back to the zone. That's really easy. So you don't need to be a developer to create an instrument. But at the moment, we've only got one knob, and this is called the beard, not the knob. So we need to crack on with it. Now, I'm not always going to want to work with the macro in the bottom right-hand corner. I might want to use the sound editor. So in that case, I can go up and test the macro page in the main workspace. A great way to test that you're actually connected to the parameter that you want to be connected to is to make sure that they're both moving or changing in both the macro page and also the sound editor window. Here's a handy tip. If you're trying to work in the macro page designer and you can't, it's more than likely because you're still in test mode. So make sure you're out of test mode to continue with your development of the instrument. You can copy a resource by holding down Alt and just moving it to another area. This brings me to an important point, lining up resources. In the top menu, I can say Show Guidelines and Ruler, and now I can right mouse click on an element or a resource and say, show horizontal or vertical guideline. You can use the cursor keys on your computer keypad to line something up with a guideline, or use the positioning controls inside of the properties section for greater precision. I'm going to be a little bit sloppy today with my positioning because we need to move through this fairly quickly and I don't want to bore you. Select multiple elements in the Gui tree and hold down Option or Alt and drag them anywhere else to copy multiple elements. I'm trying to emulate a classic analog synthesizer, so I need to make sure I've got enough controls to match up with all of the parameters that I need to build the very first oscillator. And look, there's no rules, so you don't need to have exactly the same amount of parameters because, of course, we can add more later. And this really is, I guess, a bit of an experiment because I don't know where they're all going to sit yet. And that's part, I guess, of the beauty of the challenge of designing your own instrument. It's time to start linking the Oscillator 1 parameters up with the controls. And once again, it's a matter of just dragging and dropping them straight over onto a knob. As soon as a parameter is assigned, the little icon next to it in the parameter list goes green to say, hey, this is assigned to something. And you can see what it's assigned to over in the Value tab inside of the property window under the Gui tree. There are different styles of parameters, like drop-down menus. So it's not always going to be practical to assign everything to a knob, but for now we just need to make sure we've got enough controls to cover the essential parameters for this first oscillator. And I'm one short here. So this is interesting. I've already assigned a parameter to that previous knob, so holding Alt and copy it will copy the parameter. But as soon as I drag a new parameter onto that knob, it will replace the old parameter. So that's fairly intuitive. When you select a control, the properties change to focus on that parameter, and I can see what's assigned to it in the value section, and of course we've already seen that you can change the label. I've just stepped into Superbeard mode and I'm speeding up this naming process. We're going to cover a few of the other things you can do inside of the property windows later. We've got a whole series of controls and parameters, but we need to set up some menus or switches so that we can turn things like the multi-oscillator on, or even select the wave type. So I've gone back to the browser and I'm going to the menu section. I'm just going to drag this first menu up. I thought that menus would be one of the hardest things to set up inside of this macro page designer, but it's not. It's ridiculously easy, and this is where the developers have absolutely nailed it. You just drag the menu up, you find the parameter, and you drag and drop it. And instantly, it's assigned to all of the wave types. And if I go over to my macro page, I can test it straight away. There you go. It's mind-boggling to think that this is actually still a software sampler, that these developers have prefabricated almost everything to make it easy for us to build our own instrument. And of course, you can bring your own and build your own instrument. You don't need to rely on the templates, but man, it's a good start. I've dragged another menu up and I'm positioning it above the phase control because this is going to control the retrigger. Just see how easy it is to resize it. And once again, that's the template specifying that when I resize it, it will behave in a particular way. There's a number of different types of menus down in the browser. Now, this menu doesn't have a label, so it's important to be able to see what it's representing. This menu will represent whatever selection we've made inside. And I'm not a developer, but I'm hoping that seeing that selection will make it intuitive enough for a user to go, okay, that's the wave type. Alternatively, I could get a menu with a label and actually write what the menu's for, but sometimes I guess you've got to save space. I can't recommend enough checking your instrument as you go along. I've got a fair way into developing an instrument in practice and gone, whoops, I haven't assigned any of those parameters. So once again, it's practice makes perfect. One other thing I can highly recommend, in fact it's a must if you're going to release your instrument into the public domain, is that you own the copyright or you're using copyright-free material for the images in the background. You can't just go and find a beard from anywhere on the internet and slap it into your instrument. Everything seems to be working properly, so now it's time to go and take care of my Gui Tree, and really you've got to take care of this constantly or it becomes a mess, or you'll just lose stuff. I've selected all of the resources and I'm grouping them by right mouse clicking and getting the context menu. It's important to apply some sort of logical processing to even naming because your Gui Tree is going to get quite large. Putting these controls inside of the folder has now added a perimeter or a boundary around these controls, and it's quite tight. If I click inside a group, I'll pick up on a parameter and you'll see that the perimeter stretches to still include that parameter in the group. If I take it out of focus mode, then I can move the group collectively, or I can still adjust the boundaries of the group. You'll notice now, as I adjust the top line, the faders start to disappear. But if I pick up inside the group, then I can move the group anywhere inside of the macro page. We can then continue to resize the group at any point in time. I always try and keep the group boundary as close as possible to whatever's inside. Moving along, let's get a switch so we can turn this oscillator off and on. So I'm going to the switch menu, and I'm going to find a switch with a label because I want to name this Oscillator 1. The placement of these parameters is completely up to you, but I guess it depends on why you're creating this instrument. If it's just for you, then you're going to know where everything is. But if you want to share this instrument with other people, then the placement or the user experience needs to be slick. And I guess that comes through experience and practice once again. This is the first introduction of a switch, and it's different to a knob because it's really just off and on. So I've named it and I'm going to get the correct parameter and just drag it straight over and place it on top of the switch. Now we've got two things we can do with this. Turn it off or turn it on. That's super easy, but I want to take it a step further. I want to make sure that whoever's using this will know that the oscillators are off because all of the important parameters are grayed out. So to do this, I'm going to right mouse click again and create a disable group. I said earlier that naming is quite important, and back when I created this first group, it made sense to call it Oscillator 1, but I didn't know then that that group was going to sit inside of this disable group. So I'm naming this disable group, and then I'm going to drag that first group up and place it inside of the disable group. And now it would make more sense to have this called Oscillator 1 because it's more visible and I can see it all the time. But the whole point of a disable group is to disable what's inside of it. And when I created that disable group, it created a perimeter or a border around the first group. Now we've got a property section down the bottom, and I'm going to click on 0. In development speak, 0 is really the first integer. It's the first property. So we're going to say when this switch is pressed, which is 0, we want you to do this. So I'm dragging the parameter out and I'm going to place it inside of the value, and we're going to say we want you to turn this on or off. Because I'm super clever, I'm writing in a tech tip, which means that whenever whoever uses this software hovers their mouse above this particular switch, they'll see a tech tip, except there's nothing there. Not so clever. That's because I didn't have the switch selected. So once again, it's important to be on your guard and make sure that whatever you're editing in the properties or wherever else is actually got the right focus. Now we can enable and disable this first oscillator, which is really quite good, I think, for the end user experience because it's quite clear that it's turned off and we're not relying on just a little switch. Hey, I just built my first oscillator. Well, in public anyway. I have practiced this a few times behind closed doors. Look how easy it is to build a second oscillator. Not even building it. I'm right mouse clicking and I'm saying duplicate, and there's a third oscillator. Now if I take follow focus off, I can select one of these groups, which is a disabled group by the way, and just pick up on it and drag it down. The aim is to create 3 clean rows, so I've got access to 3 oscillators. I have practiced this, like I said, a few times, and if you follow these instructions, you should be able to do this every time. Alternatively, you could save this as a template, which is in the contextual menu, which means you can access it whenever you want. The only drawback to copying and pasting is that every parameter inside of the oscillator 2 and 3 is still set to the parameters I set in that first oscillator. I guess it's not really a drawback because it is quite easy to change. It would make sense to go back into focus mode now that I'm going to start working with individual parameters again. The other thing I need to do is copy and paste these switches, or alternatively, I could just bring them up again from the resource menu or the browser down the bottom. Once I've copied and pasted them, of course, I need to change the label or the name, which is really quite easy to do again. This whole process is super easy, but like I said earlier, you've got to be on your guard. For instance, I've remembered to name these 2 oscillators, but because I've copied and pasted them, they're still assigned to the first oscillator. We're going to come back to this later. For the time being, I'm going to start connecting the second row of oscillator parameters to the parameters inside of the oscillator 2 folder over in the parameter list. Now, I'm quite sure you're getting familiar with the process of dragging and dropping parameters, so I'm going to go into super beard mode and speed this up for entertainment purposes. And now we're done. We've got 3 fully functional, perfectly operational oscillators. Well, they will be after I finish testing it. When you're sure that everything's working and operational, it's time to go up and clean up our Gui tree. I'm going to select the 3 disabled groups with everything inside and the switches, highlight them and right mouse click and say Group Selection. Let's call this page 1 for demonstration purposes. Now it's a matter of just getting things right. When I say getting things right, it's sorting out the visuals. And hey, I don't know if it's going to be right because I need to build the rest of the synth first and make sure my pages are uniformed. But I can click on that whole group now and move all of the parameters around on that page and maybe try and make it a little bit more central. I have noticed that it's a little bit hard to read some of the labels. Well, it's hard to read them over my beard anyway, but the beard has to be there, right? So this is where the benefit of a template comes in. The knob's saved as a template, so I can go into the template editor, select label and go down to properties, and I can look for a different font inside this folder. Fonts are limited because we've got different operating systems. So you've got to make sure that whoever's going to use your software is going to have access to this font. Let's go back and have a look, and that is a little bit easier to read. But there's another thing that I can do to this, and this is where the Resources tab comes into play. If I click on Resources and find my beard, I'll get the properties for my beard, and I can go down and change the opacity. So let's just reduce that by a little bit, and now it's making the font just pop out just that little bit more. Whilst we're in the Resources tab, let's just click on this knob and have a look at the bitmap. As soon as we click on it, we can see 65 different frames, which is basically an animation of this knob in different positions. We'll do more videos on this later. For now, let's keep it simple. I don't know if anyone picked up on it, but when I was testing my synth before, Oscillator 2 and Oscillator 3 rows were not disabled when they were turned off. And that's because they were still assigned to Oscillator 1. So when I copied and pasted them, I forgot to assign their parameter to the value. So there is another side to this instrument creation. The development side of things is really easy, well, in comparison to what the actual developers had to do to make it this easy. But another part is problem solving, and it's retracing your steps in a logical manner. But the beauty about this kind of software design is that if you do happen to miss something, you can just go back and reconnect it, and it's not too hard to fix the problem. As always, make sure you save as you go along, and try to save in a logical manner, because you might want to come back to this step and take the development on a different path, like a path without a beard, for instance. Anyway, if you're still with me, then we're on the same path, and I'm going to catch you in the next video, and we're going to talk about how we can take this synth design or instrument design a step further. I'll catch you there.